Hello, and welcome to the next episode of the Live Your Spa Life show. Spa Life is a lifestyle that accepts that accomplishment and harmony coexist. The Spa and Spa Life, the SPA, is for Seek Power Always, that power within you to do your deeper work in the world. I am so delighted to have my next guest on the show, Trey Kauffman, who is an entrepreneur, a podcaster, and an advocate for demanding better of ourselves. His goal is to empower others to look inward and find the happiness they deserve. His spiritual awakening occurred after realizing that others don't hold the key to his happiness. And through ridding himself of corporate toxicity, he was able to build a business and a life that he can reflect on daily with extreme gratitude. Trey, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Well, I love that you know what you're up to with your podcast, the Mosaic Life. You've had just tons of conversations around exploring happiness, and that's kind of that elusive pursuit of what that is. You've heard so many different versions of that from different people. Keeping that in mind, what's your current definition of happiness, and how has doing the podcast changed your outlook on happiness?
You know, like you kind of alluded to, it's something that I chased for a very long time, and I often refer to it as the hedonic treadmill. I used to say I'll be happy when I got a raise, or when I got a new car, or I owned a house, and I never gave myself the opportunity to be happy with what I have in this very moment. And that when I started to realize that I am fully capable of being content and finding joy and happiness with my life now, that kind of unlocked that secret for me, and it was a very awe-inspiring moment. And through these conversations, I've realized that happiness is so holistic. It's not necessarily a destination. It's kind of a frequency that we tune into. And so much of our lives, health, wellness, sleep, exercise, plays into my personal happiness.
Nice. I love that. There's so many limits that people set for themselves, around happiness, and some of it's unconscious or conscious. What have you discovered some of those limits are?
It's a good question. I think some of the limits that I've probably set in terms of my own happiness is feeling like I need to accomplish certain goals for the sake of others' approval. For me, I've come to realize that the only person that I need to be better than is the person who I was yesterday. If I'm constantly trying to be the best at everything that I do, then the best in regard to my peers and the other people around me, I'm just never going to be able to find that fulfillment. I'm an avid rock climber, I'm an avid mountain biker, and I'm never... One, I feel like I'm too old to ever be the best, but two, there's no sense in me being the best in either one of those. As long as the act brings joy to my life and strength, both mentally and physically, that is what I really, really need to be able to have that fulfillment.
So Trey, that reminds me of a story with my grandson when I used to teach him how to say, I'm the best, I'm the best, I'm the best. And that was to kind of have that internal programming that he was the best version of himself. And I remember his dad would say things like, why are you telling him that? Because what if he's not the best? And I said, I'm not looking for him to be the best in a competitive way with someone else other than himself. Like, we want to be the best version of ourselves. And I think anytime that we're able to do that, I think it makes a big difference in our sense of fulfillment. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about happiness as getting to a place of being content.
Yeah, I think it's really good to distinguish between being the best at what you do versus being the best version of yourself. I've come to realize that for myself, I know a little about a lot, and I know that's kind of a saying that people spout out there when they're not an expert in anything. And I've come to realize that I'm not an expert in anything because I've got so many interests. And I think of people like, going back to rock climbing, Alex Honnold, he cares about one thing. It's about being the best on the face of whatever mountain he's on. And he's just so tunnel visioned. He cares about nothing else in his life, which I respect. And I've always wanted something along those lines, but that's just not who I've become. But in regard to contentment, it has, it was a really strong realization for me when I decided that I just wanted to be happy with the different aspects of my lives, from my work to the podcast to my hobbies. I want to find fulfillment in those. I don't need to try to pretend to be somebody else that I was never going to be. I used to think that I wanted to be, a Silicon Valley tech entrepreneur, billionaire founder. And when I strived to live that life, I felt like I was living a fake life, and it was not fulfilling for me. And so when I started to be honest with myself about who I truly am, that's when I was really able to start to find joy and contentment in my life, because I was able to do the things that actually brought those things to the forefront.
Yeah, this is such an important thing, I think, for our listeners to really pick up on, because I think that's where some of the depression is coming in, this sense of, not being good enough and not hitting certain marks that other people hit, and not really sitting with like, what's important to me, like what's the life I want to live, and what does that actually look like, what's the imprint I want to have, what impact do I want to have on other people, because it's about our relationships. And Trey, you've created this recipe for a good day, and you track certain things in order to mark that. I'd love for you to share that.
Yeah, and so I generally say a lot of this started about almost 2 years ago exactly. A couple of things happened in my life at that point in time. The podcast started almost 2 years ago, and about almost 2 years ago now, I decided to quit drinking. And it wasn't necessarily, the two weren't necessarily connected, but they've come to be so complementary of each other, in that I set out on a mission to initially be happy all of the time, which I think is kind of futile, because so much of life is its ups and downs, and as long as we're able to maintain some level-headedness, we can have a fair sense of contentedness or contentment throughout our days. But that mission kind of transformed as I realized what happiness was, at least to me. And so I set out on a goal to feel good all of the time, and I think I've come close to accomplishing that. And so to your point, I started a journal earlier this year where I've got 10 areas of my life that I try to hit on daily. I don't know, it doesn't always happen, but it's important to me to be cognizant of what things actually add value to my life. And I know I'm not going to be able to remember all 10 off my head, but a handful, making sure that I prioritize my sleep, making sure that I'm exercising, meditating. I want to learn something new every day. I want to create something. I want to have some leisure time, because it's important to me to not be working 24 hours a day. And so there are just areas that I try to track and make sure that I'm prioritizing day in and day out, and I'm not wasting time in other areas that are not adding fulfillment to my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is so important. I know one of the ones that you mentioned to me was memory. Tell me more about that.
Yes. And yeah, so I try to write down one memory from my day. It doesn't always have to be profound. It's something to give a reference point to my day. So if I look back on April 7th of 2021, I can have some context for what was happening that day. And it just allows me to, I think a lot of that plays into gratitude as well, because gratitude is one of those 10 topics that I have. So if I can have a memory, and if I can also know why I was expressing gratitude for that day, then I can make sure that I prioritize that relationship with that person, or if it was something that brought joy to my life that particular day, then I can make sure that I'm doing it more and more often. It's just, so these are good feelings that I had during that 24-hour period that I want to be able to replicate in the future.
Right. That also reminds me of, our mutual friend, Mike C. Rock. He talks about, recording things down, journaling, each day, because a lot of times, we can say, okay, this is where we began and this is where we ended, but a lot of people have a hard time explaining how we got there. Like,
Yes.
what were some of the experiences in the middle? Like, what was the path that took you there, and what did it look like? And, once you've already done it, you don't necessarily remember like, oh, well, this day was this, or this,
Right.
I had a crossroad at this point, or this happened. And, he also mentioned it's important to, capture, the great and good things, but then you also have to say, what were the challenging things, right?
Yeah.
Because those are the things we tend to forget. And that's where, people start hearing about this overnight success, right? Because people don't talk about the journey, right? They don't talk about those ups and downs and the things that happen along the way. So I love that you are capturing, your memories and having when we bring this awareness to our actual experience, then we can really have something to share.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you brought up overnight success because I have such a vendetta against that. I think social media in general kind of breeds that idea that you can wake up one morning and have everything you've ever wished and dreamt for. And I used to believe that. I used to think I didn't need to put in the work to accomplish my goals. But when I realized that that's just not the case and I actually had to start working, that's when I started to really, take issue with the way social media promotes people's success, because to your point, it is very, very important to not necessarily highlight failure, but to learn from it. And it's not this dirty word that we all think. It's so important to fail, because if we fail trying our best, then we're going to learn from our experiences, and that's so important to do. Because if we're not failing, then even if we're succeeding, we're not growing. And growth is one of the most important avenues in my life that lead to my happiness.
Right, right. And I think sometimes when we go through, challenging things, I have a friend of mine that always says, we can do hard things. Like
Yes.
we can do hard things, right?
Yeah.
And, a lot of times people, shy away from that, and as, like you said, like it's a bad thing or you don't share it or whatever. But when we do hard things, that's what helps build our resilience. It builds like
Yeah.
who we are, and it allows us to have that growth, that when we look back on those things, it was like, oh, this is what I learned from that hard thing. Like I needed that hard thing so I could do the next thing and prepare myself for where I'm going and what I'm doing. Which reminds me, how does fear come into play for you? Like, what are some of the things that you do to move through, look at anything that's fearful?
It's a great question. Let me see if I can structure this the right way. As I mentioned, I quit drinking about 2 years ago, and one of the side effects of that I didn't really think about was that I was more willing to approach my problems head on. I used to be of the mindset that if I was feeling anxious or didn't want to deal with an issue, then I would open up a bottle of beer or wine and drink too much. And that was, I didn't consider myself an alcoholic, but I had a problem because I couldn't just have one drink. And so when I stopped drinking, I was able to approach my problems head on. With that, I think I was able to kind of address the fear of having difficult conversations, or the fear of, letting a client know that the project's going to be a little bit late because I'm trying to get it exactly right, or the fear of, addressing an awkward situation with a friend or a colleague. And I guess fear and uncomfortableness, they kind of go hand in hand for me. And I like having that conversation about being uncomfortable, because that's something that I try to put myself in more often than not. And as just kind of a obscure example, I take a cold shower every single day, and that may seem odd to some people, but it allows me to, one, get uncomfortable at least once a day, but also when it gets cold here in Columbus, Ohio, it doesn't affect me nearly as much. And I like having that mentality that I know that when I'm uncomfortable, I can handle it. And so that can lend itself to many different areas of my life, whether or not it's having a difficult conversation, or even, doing something that I'm fearful of when mountain biking. I know that I have the wherewithal to actually approach the problem or the situation or the jump and attack it with a level mind.
I love that. What part of the conversations that we have here is, what are some things that have been, disempowering our life, and things that have us, step into our power. And you've talked before about learning something new as being something disempowering. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so right now, so as you mentioned at the top, I am an entrepreneur. I am a web designer. I am a solopreneur, I guess, and I work with clients to build and maintain their websites. And so what I love about that industry is that there's just so much to learn, and I personally have so much to learn within it. And so I'm currently going through a program to become a full stack developer, which means I can do database programming, PHP, all the fun programming languages. And so I work on that classwork almost every night. It's important to me to prioritize that. I remember when we talk about fear, when I started thinking about going off my own, I had done web design in the past, but I had a lot to relearn. And so I remember just the process of getting back into it, solving a simple problem just gave me such extreme anxiety. And I worked on it and I worked on it and I worked on it until I finally was able to overcome the problem that I was having. And it felt so good. And so when I get stuck in this learning loop where I can't figure out what I'm trying to do, and I get that sinking feeling, I know that when I do overcome it, it's just going to feel so much better.
Yeah, I love that. You talk about, I love some of your insights around change. And you've talked about this mentality of doing better.
Yes. Yeah. I don't really know where that mantra came from. It's something that I close out every podcast with: take care, do better, and be well. And I'm fairly certain I've been doing that almost since the beginning. And I think it's been a challenge that I've put on myself over the last 4 or 5 years. And I will give credit to the study and philosophy of Stoicism, because that's allowed me to turn inward and really focus on my own self-improvement instead of trying to change others. And one of my favorite quotes that I love, it's how long are you going to wait before you demand the best of yourself? And that's credited to Epictetus. And I just knew that if I was going to do the things that I was capable of doing, I needed to demand the best for myself. And that meant not stepping away from challenges. That meant not taking an easy route. And so I always wanted to challenge myself to do better. If I thought that I had an extra mile in me while running, I would run that extra mile. If I thought that I had an extra hour's worth of studying in me, I would go ahead and do that studying. I want to never leave anything out in the field, as is the mantra of a lot of teams. I just want to make sure that I'm always putting my best foot forward.
So a lot of our listeners may not be familiar with Stoicism, and I'd love for you to share, how you kind of came about that, how that became a study of yours, and how it's impacting your life.
Absolutely. I always ask my guests what their one life-changing book was. And I asked that very specifically because when I read Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday, that book just absolutely transformed my life. And it really, even though it's not necessarily a book on Stoicism, the author, is very much a modern day Stoic, and he has a lot of literary pieces on Stoicism. And so through that book, I learned a lot about the ego, and not necessarily suppressing it, but enabling myself to work alongside of it. And through that, I started studying Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and I guess the pitch for Stoicism is that it's a operating system for life. And the idea is that the only thing that we have control of in our lives is how we respond to situations, not necessarily how we react to them, because we react, using that word, means that we're giving our knee-jerk reaction. Responding is taking a step back, thinking about a situation thoughtfully, and responding in a way that shines the best light on us and gives us and the people around us the best chance at overcoming an issue. And so when I was able to start realizing that I have control over my anger, I have control over other areas of my life, that's when I really wanted to dive into what Stoicism meant from, an ancient philosophical standpoint to even what it means in modern day. And so that's when I started to question my relationship with social media and alcohol, and just studying it ever since has just been profound for me.
Oh, no, that is so important. I talk a lot about that whole reaction versus responding. I mean, as a retired police officer, that was such a big thing, to not be reactive, right? It's like you have to respond. You have to be able to take that deep breath. And even in seconds, you still have to be mindful, right? And to be able to do that. And the more we can be mindful and aware of what's happening in the moment, we can make better decisions, right? We can do things in a much more connective way, communicative way. I mean, there's just so many ways that, when we're responding, and just that, that reaction, so many things can, I look at that in terms of like chain reaction, right? There's a big chain reaction when we react, and there's so many things around that, that affect us, and being intentional. And
Yes.
so, speaking of intentional, one of the things that I love to ask my guests is about your environment, your personal environment, how you are and how you live in your bedroom versus your kitchen versus your office is very different. And so, what is your favorite room in your home and why?
Oh wow. I do love my office. It's set up in a way, and I've been working. I've been working from home long before the pandemic, and so I've set it up in a way that it is conducive for me to get things done. Yeah, I'm a big book lover. I think I've got 3 or 4 bookshelves in the office and a handful more throughout my apartment, and just having that kind of that study feel, as opposed to fluorescent lighting and just a feeling that I never want to feel like I'm in an office again. I worked in many jobs and none of them really stuck for me. And I was able to create this environment in a way that allows me to be comfortable and not feel like it necessarily associates with work. And I think that has been a very good practice for me when it comes to making sure that I'm getting client work done, because I know when I come in here and sit down that I'm going to feel comfortable and it's not going to breed anxiety or stress. And that was super important for me.
You mentioned that about corporate toxicity.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what that was like for you personally and how that impacted your change in your work environment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I had, I think prior to going off my own, I had 5 or 6 quote unquote careers in probably 10 or 12 years. And I never want to place it's important to me to never place blame anywhere else aside from myself. And I don't think I was ever a great fit within any one particular organization. I had some good bosses, some pretty good managers, but one of the issues that I think comes about more often than not is that when we have a middle manager, they're not necessarily trained to lead, they're trained to manage. And I think there's a big distinguishing factor there, because when you have a manager, there's pressure put on them to hit certain numbers and goals, and the happiness and well-being of their subordinates is not necessarily a priority. And that's kind of why I never want to have employees, because I don't want to be responsible for somebody else's happiness. That's not something that I've ever had the goal of doing. And so when it came to working a 9 to 5 with somebody else, there was always this sense of, I want to go home. I want to go home. I want to go home. I want to cross off. I want to check off some check boxes. I want to, do the very bare minimum so I can get home and do something else with my life. And, obviously all companies are created differently, and there are some great companies out there to work for. And I think there's a lot of very forward-thinking companies, especially now, realizing that their employee health, mental health, and well-being is vastly more important than they initially realized. I think a lot of companies are making changes necessary to prioritize that mental health. And so, I never had that. I really didn't. And I didn't put in enough work in college to get to a point in a career that I thought was going to bring great fulfillment for me. So yes, I dealt with corporate toxicity. I know a lot of other people have dealt with it much worse than I am, or than I have. And so it was just important to me to build an environment for myself that I was going to feel fulfilled in and want to do for a long time.
Right. As you were talking about that, the thing that came up for me is this sense of slavery, right, and drudgery, and this outlook that a lot of people have around their job, which triples in or ripples down into how they feel about their life and contentment and happiness, right? So I think they go hand in hand. You hear now there's all the sayings around, oh, it's hump day, we're halfway through the work week, or TGIF, it's Friday. It's like all these things where you're trying to rush through your life because you're unhappy with the position that you're in. And I think people pigeonhole themselves to live this life because they don't look at what other options society. And I just look at that as straight up slavery, right? And so we really want to make sure that we are living the lives that we're choosing to live, that life is super short. I really learned that in the police department. I mean,
Yeah.
just, things can change on a dime, and we want to be intentional about how we're living our life and what we're doing. You had also mentioned at one point about every conversation that you have is the best conversation of your life. Explain a little bit more about that.
It's I don't think prior to starting this podcast, I ever considered myself a great conversationalist. And, I won't make that claim now, but when I get to connect with yourself, with people one-on-one via the podcast, they become the most important person in my world for an hour, hour and a half, no matter how long. And I know that I am going to give my fully undivided attention to them because I owe it to not only myself to present myself as well as I can, but I owe it to you for joining me, for lending your very valuable time. Whether you're the host or I'm the host, it doesn't matter. You are taking time out of your day to learn something new. And I can't express how much I respect that, because I think learning is something that we feel like we are forced to do in our formative years. And then when we are finally, quote unquote, free from college or anywhere else, we get to stop learning. And I think that's a travesty, because if we're not learning every single day, then we're not going to grow. And that's important to me. And so, yes, when I get the opportunity to have these conversations, you're the most important person to me in my world at that very point in time. And so it is going to be the best conversation I've ever had, because it's going to allow me to learn something new. I've recently, and this is kind of tangential, I've recently started to distinguish my language. These conversations are very much conversation for me, but when it comes to chatting online, there can be so much toxicity in that, and you don't get that same emoting. You don't get to see people's facial or vocal intonations. And so I really started to make the point of not calling those conversations, because I think if we generalize that, then we start to demonize conversations, and we attack people in a way that we wouldn't necessarily do when we're actually having a voice-to-voice conversation. So that's been important to me. So yes, these conversations are extremely valuable to me because they give me an opportunity to learn.
Yeah, I love hearing that, because as human beings, connection is such an important thing, and that's why it's been so challenging for me, even just to hear the word like social distance.
Yeah.
I think that is I hate that word, right? And I actually have a T-shirt that says social connection.
Yes.
Because I think that we owe it to ourselves as humans to be connected. When we get to the point where we fear other humans, we need to look at that. How do we need to build our immunity? Do we need to have certain things in place? I mean, everyone needs to make choices of what makes them feel safe and how they want to operate in the world. Yeah. But I think a priority needs to be, how is it that we can be connected as fellow human beings? The absolute importance, mentally, physically, about touch. Right? About that person where, of course, appropriate touch, of having, hugging someone, about touching somebody, about, the connections that we have. They're so important to be able to have that in our life. So I think that these conversations around, happiness and them being a journey are just, they're so important. And I know, Trey, our listeners are going to want to stay in contact with you. How can they do that?
Yeah, I would, of course, invite anybody who's interested in this conversation around happiness to check out the Mosaic Life podcast. It's available everywhere. You can find it at themosaiclifepodcast.com. And the best place to find me online is just at Trey Kauffman on Instagram. It's Treykauffman. That's where I do most of my social posting.
Perfect. And, this year, our theme for our podcast are people who are being a force for good in the world. And so how are you being a force for good?
Well, I want people to understand that they have the opportunity within this life to feel fulfillment, to feel contentment, and the only way that I've come to learn how to do that is by, again, demanding the best for myself. And so, if given the choice between, for me, going out to the bar or trying to accomplish a goal that I've been setting out or wanting for a long time, I need to prioritize the work that I want to put into that. And so I always challenge people to demand the best for yourself now, because to your very point earlier, we don't know how much time we have left on this earth. There's an old Stoic saying, memento mori, we could leave this earth at any point in time, and if we don't start now, we might not have another chance to do so.
Oh, so important and great words. Any final thoughts you'd like to leave with the audience?
No, I can't thank you enough for sharing this message. It's so important what you're doing, and I loved the opportunity to meet you. And as a kind of a teaser, I'm looking forward to talking with you on the Mosaic Life podcast as well.
Oh, me as well. When you started talking about happiness, I'm just like, you know what? More conversations need to be had around this, around
Yes.
what that actually means. It can be such this like slippery, elusive thing. And when we have these conversations and can get really tangible about it, then people can actually start living it, right? They can start stepping into that. So I so appreciate you just kind of stepping out on a ledge and having these conversations. And I love how you also, you guys have to definitely listen to the Mosaic Life, because as you move through the different conversations, different things come up about what that means for people. And I love how you just are going with the journey with it and getting different nuances so that people can incorporate that into their lives in a real way.
Yeah, it's extremely important to me. And I don't know. One thing that I've come to realize is that if I know anything, it's that I don't know anything. And I'm always learning and I'm always continuing to grow. And I made the point earlier, I'm not really an expert in anything. And so when I have these conversations, it's always who I am at this very point in time. And so sometimes it's tough to articulate it, but the point of the journey is that I want to be content. I want to find that joy and happiness in my life so I can just live my best life.
Yeah, well, I'd like to say that you're an expert in being Trey. Right?
I appreciate that. Thank you.
And I think that's all we need to be an expert in, is being the best version of ourselves.
Yes.
And so I so appreciate all of your wisdom, everything you've gathered, and everything that you've shared here with our guests.
Well, thank you again so incredibly much. And I look forward to talking with you again soon.
My pleasure, and looking forward to it as well. And to our listeners out there, if you've been struggling with what actually makes you happy and how you are living your life, definitely take up Trey and listen to the podcast, connect with him. The links will be in the show notes to be able to check that out. With so much depression and suicide and just, tough situations that people are experiencing right now, please, if you've not already subscribed to the show, please do so if it's calling you, and share this. Share this with someone who needs an uplifting message, who needs to have a path to get to their discovering happiness for themselves and realizing that it's something that they have to actually discover for themselves, that they're not waiting for someone else to make them happy. It's important to have those conversations to get really foundational in what that means. So please share this. Get it out there. If you have any questions around this, any comments, please, whatever platform you're on, share that. Tag both Trey and myself. We're happy to answer any questions and support you in where you're at on your journey. And until we connect again, live your spa life. Bye for now. Bye.